Once again, this is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty, whatever that means. Tonight, I'm going to expedite matters because we have very little time at the beginning of the show because David Silverman is with us, and he has a limited amount of time, I should say. And so I made a point and asked a question on my Facebook page this morning, and I made the comment, I believe in God. Then I asked the question, so am I crazy, irrational, and avoiding what's true? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the show to Christopher Mowdy, and he's actually an atheist, and he's going to try to move it forward for everyone in the context of the show. And so, Christopher, take over.
All right, everybody. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up. Dave Silverman, I don't think that we've had the pleasure of meeting before. My name's Christopher Mowdy, and I'm a host on one of the shows here at New Covenant Group. Thank you very much. It's nice to meet you. I really appreciate you taking the little bit of time that you have available to address this. Also, I have on the Google Hangout, I have Bob Graves, the unconventional pastor, and Matthew Steele, who has his own show, Elephant in the Room. And we're hoping to get Ozzy at some point. I'm not quite sure he's in the Hangout yet, though. That being said, since you have a limited amount of time, David, I would like to go directly to your response to Dr. Jones's post, and I'm just going to read it out loud, and then I'd like you to address in more detail, because of course, when you post on Facebook, it's a little more pithy than the opportunity to actually have a dialogue about it, which we're going to have right now. So what you had mentioned was, just to reiterate Dr. Jones's question, he was like, I believe in God, so does that make me irrational, crazy, or avoiding the truth? Your response was yes. You're irrational as you believe in something without logic, and indeed despite logic. This doesn't mean you're crazy. It does mean you're avoiding what's true, mortality. The real question is why. So, since you have an opportunity to add a little nuance to that, I'd like to give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Christopher. I really do appreciate that. And before I begin, I just want to premise this off by saying, it's not what I do to go up to people who are just being on their own and say, hey, you're crazy. Hey, you're irrational. I don't do that. The question was asked, and I gave a polite answer. You forgot to mention the smiley face that's in my post there.
Oh, I'm sorry. And there was a smiley face emoticon at the end.
Yeah, I like smiley faces.
So I don't want people to say that I came out swinging and attacked religion, and I'm not coming on here to trash people. But the question has been asked, and I like this show, so I'll answer the question honestly. In the history of mankind, the number of scientifically valid, rational reasons discovered, emoted to believe in a God has been zero. The amount of proof, scientifically valid proof supporting the existence of any deity ever is zero. If it were one, there would be no atheists, because all we need is proof. We're not being closed-minded here. We're just evaluating what we have as evidence, and every bit of evidence that has been put forth to support the existence of any deity has been scientifically invalid. And if that were not the case, like I said, there'd be no atheists. If we can be convinced, if you can show me scientific proof, I'll drop my job today, and I'll join your church. But you're not going to be able to do that because it doesn't exist. Now, that means that it is irrational to believe something exists that breaks all the known laws of physics and has no support for it. We are talking about unicorns. We are talking about Zeus. We are talking about Yahweh. And no person can describe why it's right to believe in Yahweh versus wrong to believe in Zeus. They're the same thing, but they believe it anyways. That's not rational, okay? That's why I said it's not rational. It's not crazy. It's a little crazy, okay? It's a little crazy. I just don't like to use the word crazy because it's got such negative connotations, and I don't want people to come out and say, Dave Silverman said that all religious people are crazy. But they're a little bit crazy, okay? They're believing in something irrational, And the question is why. The reason that I would propose is that we are all afraid of death. Humanity, in fact, all sentient life fears death. And religion was invented to dissuade us from that fear, to protect us from that fear. And that's the truth that I was referring to that Dr. Jones is trying to escape. He's trying to escape the truth. And I'm not saying that he's doing it deliberately, and I'm not saying he's the only one. In fact, this is what believers do. They try to escape the truth that they're going to die, that they are mortal, that when they die, they're not going to see their family in heaven. There's no afterlife. They're trying to escape the fact that we have absolutely no reason to believe that there is any sort of afterlife for humans, but there isn't one for doggies and kitties and dolphins and chimpanzees. There's no reasonable reason to believe that there, I mean, we say, oh, no, there's no dog heaven. Well, if there's, how do you make that decision? You don't. It's arbitrary. People are making it up as they go along because they don't like the truth that they are going to die. And what I was positing in that post was that Dr. Jones, like almost every other human on the planet, fears death. And that's the truth that he's trying to escape by clouding the mind, clouding his own mind and digging in and holding on to an irrational belief that has no scientific basis at all. And that's where I'm going. Now, if you want to call that crazy, you can call that crazy. I know a lot of people who would call that crazy. I wouldn't call that crazy because when I say something is crazy, I mean, crazy as in insane asylum crazy. I mean, that's a serious word. Okay, I don't like to use the word crazy. That's why I'll only say, okay, if you're believing something irrational, if you're believing something illogical, you're holding on to it despite no reason to do so, it's a little bit crazy. But I wouldn't call a religious person a crazy person. I would say they believe something crazy.
I appreciate the nuance that you added to it. And I'd like to say before I respond that I am also an atheist. So just so you know where I'm coming from when I say this, because I'm going to push back a little bit, and I'm going to bust your chops a tiny bit about what you said. There are two components about what you said, and this is all for the sake of dialogue, of course.
Of course.
And the 2 points that I want to bring up are, you mentioned evidence, and you seemed to pigeonhole evidence as scientific evidence, which is more quantitative than qualitative. And it seems that you've dismissed the whole area of qualitative evidence that is possible via subjective experience and things like that. So before I go on to the second point, I'll just give you an opportunity to address that.
So if I told you that I had a personal experience, I saw a unicorn, I saw a talking unicorn, and that was a personal experience, I saw it. I'm willing to stand up on a Bible and say that I saw it. Yeah, nobody else was there who saw the unicorn. In fact, I can't really show you any evidence at all that the unicorn was there. He didn't leave any tracks or posts or anything like that. So there's no quantifiable evidence that the unicorn exists, but I have a subjective opinion that the unicorn exists. Is that proof?
Well, the actual content of, and the difference between what we're talking about is very few people admit that talking unicorns fulfill their lives in such a way that it makes them a better person. And that's the component that I'm looking at personally. So if somebody did come to me with the very thing that you just said, I'm kind of like a Vito Corleone from The Godfather, right? Like, hey man, so long as your interests don't interfere with my interests, believe in talking unicorns all you want, so long as you're a contributing member to society, you're able to engage in rational decisions other than this component of the talking unicorn. It's kind of none of my business.
So you just admitted that the talking unicorn is not rational. And you're saying that it's okay if somebody believes in it, but that's not the question. The question is it rational?
And so that's the second component. And I did make the distinction between God and talking unicorns. So in talking about talking unicorns, I'm happy to call that irrational, but to equate belief in a God with belief in a talking unicorn, and once again, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe that God, I don't believe in anything supernatural, right? So if I'm pushed into a corner, I'll happily argue that to the nth degree, right?
Yep.
But for the sake of discussion, I'm making this distinction. So the second point that I wanted to make, which you just brought up, was the irrationality component. Now, I'm a student of psychology. I'm a laboratory manager for a lab that studies the psychology, cognitive science, and perception of olfaction, right? So that being said, I'm familiar with areas of psychology like behavioral economics, which make it clear in no uncertain terms, and I'm thinking about authors like Kahneman and Tversky and Dan Ariely, that we're all irrational. We're so irrational as humans that we're predictably irrational in such a way that there are experiments that betray the fact that if you're trying to claim that the decisions made between theists and atheists, and this is an assumption I'm making, and I'd love for you to add nuance to it, is that atheists are coming to their conclusions via logic and rationality, and theists are not. I'm going to challenge that and say that I'd like to disabuse you of that because both atheists and theists are humans, and humans are known to break down their logic when coming to complex decisions and rely more on preferences than logic just because of the overwhelming amount of information that would be required to process for those complex decisions. And I consider this one of those complex decisions.
I believe you're agreeing with me. What I said was that he is choosing to not to not believe in death. I think that you're agreeing with me that they are selectively doing that. And I certainly agree with you, Christopher, that we're all a little wacky. And we all have our shtick.
That's where I was going with that.
Yeah. That's why I don't like to use the word crazy, okay? Because it's so relative. Because everybody's a little bit crazy in some way. That's why I don't like to use the word crazy. But when you're saying that something is rational, you're saying it's something that has to do with logic. And my point is that no matter how people choose, and no matter how happy it makes them, it doesn't make it reasonable or rational to believe in an invisible man in the sky. And I would challenge you, Christopher, to come back and say, okay, Dave, I'm putting your pink unicorn and your God in different corners. I would challenge you to tell me why, because I don't believe you can.
As I mentioned, very few people...
I think I could give you a few reasons.
Go ahead, Bob, please.
The alleged God is an immaterial spirit. A pink unicorn would actually be a physically, materially existing being, and so just their alleged properties would require that the manifestation of those properties would be different, and so therefore
the unicorn that I saw had no physical properties. She appeared in front of me, but she had no physical properties at all. I saw it. You can't prove me wrong.
No, I can't. And so, if that's what you're going to believe, and that was your experience, I think I could even go so far as to actually believe that was your experience.
But it wouldn't be rational.
But to my point,
why would that
we're
not be rational?
Why would I guess what I'm going?
The fact that anything else is not rational is not the point. The invisible, untraceable unicorn is irrational. Yes.
But that being said, the point that I'm making, Bob, I'd like to interject here. The point that I'm making is because we're all irrational, saying that making a distinction between atheists and theists such that a belief that separates them is irrational on one side and rational on the other is both true, maybe, and irrelevant.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think it's irrelevant, and I think we have to get to the point where I think what we have to get to is, I'm not saying this is not a my religion versus your religion question, okay? This is not a my favorite color versus your favorite color question. Every bit of evidence that we have ever learned says atheism is right and religion is wrong.
But isn't that your own dogma? Aren't you espousing your own dogma right now?
Am I espousing a dogma? Are you trying to change the subject?
No, I'm saying
I'm
making a point.
The amount of proof supporting the existence of a deity is zero. This is a right versus wrong thing, not a my way versus your way thing. And yes, it's very, very possible for atheists to be rational, and for people who believe in an invisible man in the sky to be irrational.
Is there actually evidence to prove there is no God?
I'm sorry?
Is there actually a rational and scientific basis for saying that?
I'm saying that there's no reason to believe in anything that breaks all known laws of physics. If you're going to say that something breaks all known laws of physics exists, you're going to have sort of proof. Just like an undetectable floating pink unicorn. If you're going to say that something like that exists that breaks everything that we know, simply because of subjective feelings, or simply because of a book, or simply because lots of people believe it, that's
Okay,
not
explain to me how the pink unicorn breaks the laws of physics. That's not clear to me. I can see that it may not fit in, but I don't see how it breaks it. And
I said
not
all
that I believe in
known
pink
laws of
unicorns.
physics, okay? And yeah, if the unicorn exists and I can see it, so it's bending light, but nobody else can see it, though it's not bending light, that kind of breaks a law of physics. If it appears and then disappears, that
How do
kind
you
of
know that
breaks a
it's
law of
bending
physics.
light? Maybe you're seeing it because it somehow stimulates the life energy within your brain or something.
Well,
I mean,
Bob, I'd like
In
to
the
interrupt.
occurs
I'd like to
that
interrupt for
aliens are
1
showing
second.
us a thing. You know, that
Sure.
you need proof. If you're going to say, okay, I saw a unicorn, I'm going to say, okay, prove it. And then you can prove it. You can say, oh, look, the aliens are up there and they've got a machine and it makes the unicorn appear. Well, that's proof. Now I'm convinced. But until that happens, there is no God.
I'd like to interrupt for 1 second in respect for the fact that you only have a limited amount of time. I did want to add context to my point about the whole dogma thing. Now, you mentioned this is not a my religion versus your religion thing. And I guess I was riffing off of the ideas that religions, and once again, I'm an atheist, so I happen to sometimes equivocate religion with dogma. It sounded like you were indeed talking about one religion versus another religion. I'm not saying atheist is a religion. That's not where I'm going. But I am saying that the way that you're talking about empirical and scientific evidence as being the only standard by which to measure things, that is in itself a dogmatic opinion.
Christopher, I will go out with this. Those scientific reasons are the only way that an opinion can be termed rational. Rational means logical and reasonable. If you say, I'm going to make something up, I'm going to feel it, I'm going to use qualitative feelings, which is basically subjective, which is basically personal feelings, which is basically opinion and fantasy. If you're going to say that's rational proof, that's not rational proof. Rational proof is scientific proof. Rational proof is quantitative proof. Rational proof is logical proof, something that is consistent. If there was anything
I can agree with
that
you that
showed
subjective feelings do not constitute rationality, but I don't know that they also thereby constitute irrationality. I mean,
No.
if I really prefer black raspberry ice cream to chocolate,
No, I want to be clear. But saying something that breaks the laws of physics exists based solely on qualitative data, as Christopher was saying, is not rational. That's not valid.
But you keep using the term, and once again, I don't want to keep you, but you happen to mention the term known physics. And, and so you will, so that implies that you're willing to accept that in the future, the things that, might seem supernatural to us now, might very well come under the purview of the naturalistic methodology that is a criteria for the scientific method, right? I think it was Isaac Asimov who said, any well-established science seems like magic to people from 50 years ago. I'm destroying and paraphrasing that in some way, shape, or form. But the point, I think, holds to the discussion we're having right now. So
Absolutely. I would be a lousy skeptic if I said there was no way that you could change my mind. For those of you who watched the Bill Nye debate, I thought the best part was that question, what would change your mind?
Yeah.
And Ken Ham said, nothing would change my mind. Well,
Yes.
That's not skepticism. That's not rational either. If you can prove me wrong, you can prove me wrong. And I will thank you for proving me wrong, and I will change to do what's right. But you got to prove it using rational, reasonable, and logical scientific methods.
even though we're all mostly irrational.
Yep.
Okay.
I wonder,
So
I
it
wonder if I
sounds
could inject a few
And I
thoughts
don't
on
agree that we're all
rationality.
mostly irrational. I'm not gonna give you that. Even though we all have a little bit of irrationality, we do have to stick to what we know to be rational. And if we're just going to say, okay, well, we're irrational beings, therefore I'm going to say that something is irrational, something that is irrational is rational, that doesn't follow either. It doesn't matter that we're slightly or moderately or very irrational beings. We've defined rational as logic and reasonable, and I'm saying that it is not logic and reasonable to believe in something that breaks everything we know without proof. That's right. That's
Dave,
reasonable.
It is so fun having a dialogue with you. I just need to let you know, like, I could do this for much longer, but I understand that your time is limited. Do you have an extra minute? Because I know you've only had a chance to talk to Bob and I know that Matthew has a question.
Well, let's do
for you.
one more question.
Okay, so the last question, because I know you have to go, is going to go to my friend Matthew.
Hi, Matthew.
Hello. I asked you before the show if you knew who I was, and you answered my questions in the interview for the Skeptic Fence show.
Okay.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
The questions.
I remember
through
some of
life
it.
that
I do a
asked
lot
you.
of these new interviews, Matthew, so
Of course.
I don't remember
Of
a
course,
lot.
that's-
What can I do for you?
I'm asking if you had a chance to watch the Skeptic Fence show where I responded to you on last Saturday evening.
No, I have not.
Okay. My concern, as also an atheist, and I would like to say that I don't think there's any rational reason for us to believe in the Abrahamic God. Whether it's Islam, Judaism, most understandings of Christianity, or any of those religions, the way that they are 99% of the time practiced, I would say that's irrational. However, that doesn't mean that any understanding of the word God is necessarily irrational. That doesn't mean that any way that someone might understand the term God as a theist is irrational. So making a blanket statement that a belief in God is irrational would be presupposing that you understand every possible explanation of the word God. So I'm just wondering what your justification is to say that no gods exist and that you know it to be true, and furthermore that religion is a lie when you yourself don't know all of the things that the term God could mean.
So you're arguing for agnosticism?
No, agnosticism is the only rational position, as far as I'm concerned, in the discussion with regards to all that God could mean. Now, if you're talking about a assertion of belief, like, say, fundamentalist Christianity, obviously, I'm a hard atheist with regards to the Bible and the Quran, but that doesn't encapsulate everything that the term God means. That's just what some people understand and claims that some people make. That doesn't mean that's the only thing that the term God means. So I think that you are addressing and fighting against the majority of the problem for established religion in the U.S., but that does not mean that you get to make blanket statements about the rationality of an entire thought system of believing that there's something that does exist that you can't necessarily rationally explain to someone else, but it doesn't mean that it's irrational. It just means that there are limitations to our understanding of the universe, of how things work. And since we have those limitations, we have to accept them to be rational.
Out of respect for David, I'd like to give him the last word in responding to the content that you've provided, and then he's got to go.
This is where agnosticism becomes dangerous, because it allows people to make apologies for religion. First of all, let's put down a rule here. When we're talking about God, lowercase g God, we're talking about something supernatural. Okay? I know that, if you go to AA, sometimes we'll say, well, let's say that God is some higher thing or some higher purpose. I'm not going to get into that. When I'm talking about God, I'm talking about something supernatural. A God is something supernatural. In the history of the world, the amount of evidence to believe in something supernatural is zero. It doesn't matter what you call your God. It doesn't matter where you call your God. If you say, look, I've got a cup and it's supernatural, it's irrational. That's my point. And don't let your agnosticism get in the way. Hold on a second, Matthew.
You can't back that up rationally.
Hold on a second, Matthew. Let me put this out here. The fact that you can't explain it, the fact that you understand that you have your own limitations as a human, doesn't mean you can't use the word know. I know something. You can. We do. We know things, and we know just as much about. We can say we know there is no God, there are no gods, there is nothing supernatural, with the same certainty that we can say that we know gravity exists. We know this. And until we find something different, yes, of course, we're all, we don't know everything. And yes, you can prove me wrong anytime you want to. But until you have some inkling of evidence for something supernatural, something that breaks all the laws of physics, yes, it is very irrational to say that anything supernatural exists. You have to have a reason to believe it. Wanting to believe it is true, is not rational. Saying a whole bunch of people believe it's true, it's not rational.
That
Gentlemen,
statement is
gentlemen,
irrational.
this
The
is
argument you
not
just
open
put
for
out there,
discussion.
David,
I'm
is
sorry,
irrational.
guys. I need to interrupt. This is not open for discussion. That was David's parting statement, so I'm going to allow Dr. Jones to say goodbye to David. Dave.
Dave, I wanted to tell you how much I appreciate you coming on the show. You did it, that is, as a last-minute thing. I enjoyed you on our last show. We studied the Bible together. It was awesome.
It was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. We want you to come back and do this again, and we respect you very much in every way. And so thank you for...
You know something, Dr. Jones? I want to say that I do a lot of these shows, and a lot of them are a lot ruder and a lot... I like this show, too. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well,
I like you, and I like this show, and I like talking to you, and I like the fact that you let me finish my sentences. It's kind of novel for me. And so I'll be happy to do the show again some other time.
Sounds good. And have fun out in California. Enjoy yourself.
Rock and roll.
Hey,
Take care.
You take care. Bye-bye.
All right,
Bye-bye.
take care, Dave.
Thank you so much.
All right, so that was Dave Silverman, president of the American Atheists Association, and he addressed the very question that we're talking about tonight. And for those of you that may have recently tuned in, the topic for tonight is, does belief in God make the believer irrational, crazy, or somehow avoiding the truth? And this is all based on a Facebook post that was posted by Dr. Jones. And he posted it in a couple different places. And I have to admit, each of the places he posted it garnered very different responses. So before I go into it, and I have in front of me the actual post and a bunch of the responses, and I'm going to use them as grist for the mill, if you will. But before I do, I would like to give the panel an opportunity to address it, each person at a time. Now, I know Ozzy just got into the conversation a little while ago, and we haven't heard from him. We heard from Bob, and we heard from me, and we heard from Dr. Jones, and we heard from Matthew, but Ozzy is the silent one right now. So I would like to start with Ozzy's opinion about this topic.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was a little late. I got the time wrong, and I wish I had been on time because I would have enjoyed an opportunity to lock horns with David Silverman on some of this stuff. Yeah, okay. My sense about rationality here is that no proposition by itself, unless it is incoherent and self-contradictory, is ever irrational. If you assert a proposition, whether or not it's rational, has to do with how you got to it, not the content of the proposition, except in cases where it is self-contradictory.
Could you go more into that, Ozzy?
Yeah, sure. I'll take my own case. I mean, I used to be a theist. In fact, I used to be a creationist and a fundamentalist, a young Earth creationist. Now, I came by that belief honestly. I wasn't lying to myself. I wasn't trying to not know the truth or deny anything. I was a child growing up in a religion, and like everybody who's growing up, you believe what the folks around you tell you. That is your sort of naive, simple epistemology when you're growing up. That I was operating as responsibly as I possibly could as an epistemic agent at that age. It was not a very sophisticated epistemology. I hadn't had discovered a lot of my beliefs to be false and debunked. I hadn't acquired certain critical faculties that I would later on. But lots of people simply believe things because they've been told. And it doesn't just have to do with religion. The number of people who believe evolution who don't know a thing about it, and I mean nothing, right? Who are completely confounded when they hear, if we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? And who don't have a response because they don't know the first thing about evolution. Okay.
So I want to interrupt you just for 1 second, Ozzy. So it sounds like you're talking about the kinds of atheists that will champion science and they will have the newest Stephen Hawking book on their shelf. But that's kind of where it stays without the bind being broken in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the point here is I'm not just trying to level the playing field here, and I want to state my biases clearly. I do think that, strictly speaking, theism is a species of superstition, and all superstitions are irrational. So I think that it is irrational, but it's wrong to say that people are irrational simply by virtue of the fact that they happen to believe this proposition. Propositions by themselves are not irrational. People are irrational. Arguments are irrational. It's how you get to the conclusion that earns the word irrational here. If you want to say that a proposition is irrational, that a belief is irrational, there's a certain sense in which you can say that. It's an attenuated sense. It's a kind of shorthand way for saying, by my lights, I don't think anyone can get there on the basis of warranted evidence and good reasoning. That's what you're saying, okay? And I stand by that. I think that people who are theists have not gotten there through proper reasoning. I think they have made mistakes along the way. But it's not to say that they're being irrational. It's to say that they've made mistakes. They are simply in error. They're not being irresponsible epistemic agents by and large. Now, some people are. Some people engage in self-deception. Some people are practicing a kind of self-delusion. Some people are trying to avoid certain uncomfortable truths. Those people exist. Some people rationalize. We all rationalize to one degree or another. And when we do that, we are in fact being irrational. But I don't think that you are irrational simply by virtue of believing something that is false and there's no good pathway to it. So I think theism is irrational, yes, but I don't think that you're automatically irrational because you're a theist. That I think is a gross overstatement, and it's to misunderstand what can be properly called irrational. People are irrational, a reasoning process is irrational, an argument is irrational. A mere proposition, unless it happens to be incoherent or self-contradictory, isn't irrational. And so if a person comes by their beliefs honestly and as responsibly as they can, well, they're not being irrational, they're just mistaken.
Ozzy, can I challenge you a little bit? Because Dave Silverman's not here, I kind of want to play the role of devil's advocate, right?
Yeah.
So are you saying that my subjective belief in a talking pink unicorn is not irrational?
No, I would think that's irrational, just because I don't think there's any way to get there by means of reason. Okay, but it doesn't mean that you are an irrational person, and I don't believe even. See, it's a little bit complicated by the fact of this example of a unicorn that was given.
You know, if I could just interrupt for just a moment, the only people I've ever known who had a belief that I would put in the category of believing in a pink unicorn, and I've known some people who had beliefs kind of like that. The only people I've ever known who possessed a belief of that quality were people I knew who were in a mental ward and had where there was definite evidence that there were certain cognitive deficiencies that they were struggling with.
So
but I don't think
clinical delusions.
Correct. I've known people who believed in some odd manifestations and things like that. But I don't think that I could say that all of the people I've known who are theists would fit into the category of possessing some of these same clinical deficiencies.
Well, okay. Well,
so there's something in the quality.
I have opinions about that, but you happen to go interrupt Ozzy. And I think I'd like Ozzy to finish the trajectory of what he's saying.
Oh, okay, thank you. This example of sort of the unicorn. Everything, all our evidence is mediated by through our minds, through our experiences. So everything comes through our experiences. And what distinguishes something that is a mere experience, like a feeling or an emotion or a subjective experience of pain, from objective experience is intersubjective agreement. So if a person has a belief and they say, wow, I experienced a unicorn or something like that, Silverman gave this example and he said, would that be rational? Would that convince you if I said that? And well, no, you're just one person saying this. It's very easy for you to be mistaken. But the question is, if that happened to you, would you trust your senses, or would you think you were nuts? Well, you might think you're nuts if you have reason to think you're nuts. But if as far as you can tell, everything is operating properly, if you see a unicorn one day when you're in the woods, you're going to go, oh, how about that? All those tall tales I heard and legends, they're friggin' real. That's what I would think if I saw a unicorn. I wouldn't think I was nuts if I thought everything was operating properly. I would think, well, by God, by the unicorn, there are unicorns.
I just want to point out how calmly you represent how you would think if you saw a pink unicorn, right? Most of us would be like, holy shit!
Yes.
Whereas Ozzy's like, would you look at that? Pink unicorns exist.
Yeah, okay. Now, of course, I mean, if I had some reason to think that I had been on drugs, or I was overtired, or under some kind of weird stresses, or something like that, then of course I would question my experience. But under normal observational circumstances, if I could like really get a good long look and check and follow the thing and go, oh my goodness, I can't believe my eyes. It's a real animal. It's not, someone hasn't stuck some artificial thing on top of a horse's head. This is the real thing. I would believe my senses. The fact that I could convince no one wouldn't change my mind about a thing. Okay, if I couldn't persuade you, well, that's another question. So what would persuade me and what would persuade another person are not always the same thing. So you can't just dismiss a person as irrational when if they've had an experience simply on the grounds that their testimony doesn't impress you. Of course, if someone told me that story, I'd think, oh, come on, I wouldn't just take it at face value. So intersubjective agreement is very important, but it's not just a matter of, oh, well, if I couldn't convince another person, then I shouldn't believe it myself. That's not how we operate, and it mischaracterizes how this goes. And he kept talking about proof and proof and proof. Look, that's just sort of it's got to be, I hope, is just code for sufficient evidence and reasons to warrant a belief. That's all we need. We don't need absolute proof one way or the other for or against God.
Well, Ozzy, the very thing that you're talking about, I attempted to challenge him on, and he had a limited amount of time, and so he addressed it. And also, let's keep in mind, Dave Silverman does a shit ton of interviews. He is very good at the talking points that serve him well in those challenging interviews that he does so frequently. This wasn't so much a challenging interview, and as much as it was, at least from my perspective, a probing interview to determine where he was with things. And so the thing that you're talking about, where he addressed evidence and proof and things like that, and the very thing that you said, where, hey, if somebody presents a claim, you should, address it from the reasonable evidence that maybe they provide. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. But that being said, the style of evidence, the type of evidence that he's relying on as the gold standard, well, not as the gold standard, as the only standard, right? Because I think, as a scientist, I think that science is the gold standard as well. But I don't want to wear it on my sleeve. But I realize that it's not the only standard that exists. I try to, nudge him towards the idea that in itself is somewhat dogmatic. If you're going to say, hey, man, I need evidence of your claim, and by evidence, I mean this little nugget of empirical, scientifically proven evidence, then that's dogmatic, because there are so many things that we don't. Science isn't built on the fact that we know everything. And if you're going to rely completely on that, I'm not going to accuse Dave of scientism. I really don't think that he's coming from that place. But I do think that he's not admitting the unknown unknowns.
Yeah, but I have to say in his defense, though, that you can never justify a belief, an actual assertion, merely because it's logically possible. The fact that something is merely logically possible and it can't be absolutely ruled out is never a reason to just admit that thing into your ontology. If you were to do that, you would bloat your ontology with a million inconsistent things that are all logically possible but not logically compatible with each other, which is why we say, no, it's not enough that it's merely logically possible, and that's why when someone says, but you can't prove that it's not the case, is never a good rejoinder. That's not the principle that we operate by. That's why we look for reasons and or evidence. But I think that Silverman, I thought he was right on that, but I think he was wrong possibly. I didn't hear the very beginning, but it sounded to me like he was sort of construing evidence rather narrowly. And that's why I think he was going on with this business about the unicorn and experience. I mean, consider a different kind of scenario. Imagine that everybody in the world 5 minutes from now had the following experience. They all hear in their heads, not out loud, they just hear it in their heads, like you hear a ringing in your ears. You know it's a ringing in your ears.
Right.
They all hear, I am that I am. I am the God of Abraham, and I'm a tripartite God, or something like that, triune God, or something like that, okay? Everybody on earth hears that simultaneously, day or night, no matter where they are. People who are sleeping wake up and go, I had the most extraordinary dream. And we all, corroborate these stories with one another. I mean, if that happened, we wouldn't need any physical evidence. I mean, Christianity would stand confirmed as a science right then and there. We would know it. And there would be nothing physical to look at. And generations from now, people would think, did this really happen? But we would all know that it happened. So, I mean, subjective mental experiences, the reason we trust them in other people is because there's this intersubjective agreement. When it's one person by themselves, as Bob said, that's when you kind of sort of write them off. But when enough people believe these things, then you kind of have to, it should give you pause. And so the fact that people report religious experiences and they're not by themselves is why they trust their experiences. They know that other people have had similar experiences. Where I think it starts to then fall apart is that people have all these kinds of experiences, but they're all allegedly pointing to other gods and different metaphysical principles, and they're completely incompatible. And this, I think, undermines the character of that kind of experience, which is why I don't put much stock in it, and why I think people should not put stock in it.
Okay.
But a lot of people are not aware of that. Yep.
I appreciate your input. Now, I'm going to go to Matthew next, but before I do, I want to make it clear to Bob that I'm not ignoring you, bro, but you happen to be very interactive and engaging with the very thread that Dr. Jones put up. So I know you got tons of things to say, and you've already had an opportunity to say them in a bunch of your responses. So I'm gonna save you for last, if you don't mind. And it's not because I'm ignoring you in any way, shape, or form. It's just the flow that I'm deciding on. Is that cool with you?
That's totally cool, sure.
I appreciate that. So that being said, Matthew, I'd like you to address the question tabula rasa, as if this is the first time you saw it. How do you respond to that?
Well, the question of whether or not it's rational to believe in God begs the question, what does God mean? I can't get past that point, because if you don't have an understanding of what the word God means, yes, before you say it's rational or irrational, you are making a huge error. We just assume that everyone's talking about Yahweh or Jesus or Allah or Krishna or whoever. We assume that because we're not thinking all the way down to the bedrock of what does this particular person that I'm talking to believe. I don't remember at any point in Dave's discussion with Dr. Jones if he ever asked him, what do you actually believe? He just assumed that he knew what Dr. Jones believes. And even if he had talked to Dr. Jones for an hour, 2 hours, he still wouldn't have a full understanding of Dr. Jones's particular belief any more than he would have any understanding of Bob's belief. It's just a question of how much time and effort you want to put into understanding someone's viewpoint. You can't just say that everyone who believes in God or gods is necessarily irrational just by believing that when you don't even know what they're saying they believe in. If you don't even ask, you say all people who believe in God are irrational, then you yourself are being irrational. Because if you say no gods exist, no gods can exist, then you are pretending that you know everything about what the word God means. You don't.
Matthew, allow me to take it one level deeper. What does that mean to you? What does it mean to you when somebody comes to a discussion and instead of asking what somebody believes, they take the stance that they already know what somebody believes and starts arguing from that point? What does that say to you?
Well, I can't help but equate it to somebody like Saitan Brigade, who says that atheists know that God exists. to say that theists are, for example, as Dave has said recently, almost verbatim, that religion is a lie propagated by people who know it's a lie. That is, to me, it equates perfectly, almost in polar opposites of intent or of belief. That Cy is saying that atheists know God exists. Dave is saying that theists know that God does not exist. They know that it's a lie. It's exactly the same thing, and in that way, they are equally ridiculous.
I just want to put a fine point on what you're saying, Matthew. You're saying that the way in which Dave Silverman is approaching the conversation is not dissimilar and is in fact similar to the way that a Psi 10 Bruggencate would approach the same conversation, just coming at the center of the wheel from two different spokes.
Right. To say that you know what is in someone else's head based on what you think you understand about reality it's to assume that you know more than you do. Since you can't read the mind of someone else, the revelation that Psi is getting from God, supposedly, is telling him that atheists know, because God told him, atheists know that he exists. And the opposite of that with Dave is that he's saying that since science can't prove God, and since the supernatural is therefore impossible, since it would deny the laws of physics, then that informs him that theists know there is no God. And both of them are just completely obtuse understandings of the way things work. What if someone genuinely believes that there is a God? They're not lying. They think it's absolutely true.
You're talking about the majority of the humans that exist in the world?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
They know on some level that it is a matter of their belief, that they may not be able to prove it to someone else. Some of them think there are rational arguments they can make to prove it. Some of them don't. Some of them just say, this is what I believe. I'm not going to argue with it about it. It's just what I think. And that, to me, is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's only when you try to use that to inform someone else's understanding of reality, to tell them, as Dave is doing and Cy is doing, that their understanding is wrong, and then use an inappropriate methodology to explain why it's wrong.
Now,
it shows that he's uninformed and he doesn't know how to explain his viewpoint in a way that it's going to be understood by someone else, and it's nonsense.
Before I throw it to Bob, I do want to address a little bit of what you're saying, because it's resonating with me. Obviously, Matthew and I are friends, and we're friends because most of the things that we talk about we're in agreement on. But for the sake of the viewing audience and out of my own curiosity, it sounds like you're addressing the point that I tried to make, where I asked Dave, or told Dave, that his position was as dogmatic as a theist's. I'd like you to address that.
That his position is as dogmatic as a theist. I would agree with that. That it's not necessarily that all theists are dogmatic. I would argue that they are not. Most of them are, in the U.S. at least. There's a high percentage of people who believe in some form of a literal Bible. Just like in the Middle East, there's a high percentage of people who believe in a literal interpretation of the Quran. Sure. That being said, that doesn't mean that all of them are. So to put a blanket statement on something like religion and say religion is therefore not only a lie but needs to be destroyed, literally, that is a dogma.
Well, I appreciate the nuance you put on it. I have to admit that my question was not as articulate as I wanted it to be, but I did want you to address the dogma component of what I brought to the table when talking to Dave.
Right.
And I just wanted to bounce it off of you.
I think I disagree with this. If I can interject again.
Please do.
Okay. And sorry, Bob. I know you're being extremely patient, but I want to push back against what you and Matthew are saying here. I'm not sure that Dave Silverman is being dogmatic in that way. I mean, I think he is overstating some things there, but comparing him to someone like Psi 10 Bruggencate or that flavor of presuppositionalism, I think seems too strong. I don't think Dave Silverman thinks that it's irrational in the same way. As he sees it, people don't have good reasons for what they believe when they believe in religion. By his lights, he can't think of a case where someone has given sufficient warrant. Okay, it's not that, and I don't think he'd insist on proof, but what he's calling proof is really just evidence. They don't have good enough evidence to warrant the belief. So they're all, as far as he's concerned, operating under some kind of delusion and false consciousness, because surely they have to be able to see that the same standard of evidence applied anywhere else would not be convincing, but in this case they're taking it as convincing. So they're compartmentalizing, they're lowering their standard of evidence when it comes to this kind of question. I think that's the kind of thing that he has in mind. I've heard him talk before, and it seems to me that I've heard him speak about this compartmentalization, and I think that's what he's thinking. And,
Okay,
I think he could be talked out of that.
I'd like to interject. I have no problem with what you just said at all, and I'm
Okay.
speaking to a different point.
Okay. Well, it just seems to me that the point he's making then is not quite so dogmatic. I mean, it seems to me that he has a good argument, and that it's not a dogma. He's not merely asserting it and saying it's impossible that I'm wrong about this. It seems to me that he has a sound way of arriving at that conclusion. It's certainly one that's close to my own, actually. So maybe I'm, betraying my biases here, but.
I'm talking about his assertion that religion is a lie, belief in God is a lie, and theists know that it's a lie. I've heard him say that specifically. I've also heard him say that no gods exist or ever have. And that is a belief I know that you also share, but the way that he packages it, the way that he presents it in such a way that there's nothing in the world that could make him wrong. It would only be I don't know what, we're straying way off of the point here, I think. And if it's just a matter of the rationality of it, I'm not even necessarily talking about his response to Dr. Jones's Facebook post. I'm talking about his general outlook on theism and atheism, the way that he approaches it, and people who agree with him approach it. It's not as clearly defined as they believe it is. That's my viewpoint.
Yeah.
It's not as clear cut as saying that anyone who believes in a God is irrational, because that presupposes that you know everything that they know. Just because someone can't explain something rationally doesn't mean they have an irrational belief. It just means that rationality can't be used to clarify it to someone else. That's all.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree that he's his message is presented in a way that I think is obnoxious and as a result somewhat self-defeating, because it's going to fall hard on some ears. They're just, some people are just going to recoil at this who would otherwise be more sympathetic and receptive to it. But I don't know. I think it's of course wrong, as I said at the outset, to say that everyone who believes these things is a liar. I think that is too strong. I think that that's wrong. But what he's talking about there is that there's a kind of intellectual a self-deception, a dishonesty with oneself, by virtue of the fact that people are knowingly applying a different standard, a lower standard of evidence for these kinds of beliefs than they are for the other beliefs in their lives. Now, I think people do that. I think that people do engage in that kind of thing, but I don't think that they do it knowingly. And once people start to sense that, that's when the cognitive dissonance starts to build, and then the rationalization starts to come in, and that's when people start to get dishonest. But typically, people I don't think are dishonest. They come by these beliefs honestly. It is an honest mistake to have different standards of evidence for some subset of your beliefs. I think that is a mistake that we make, and it's not a self-conscious lie. And when he puts it, so I agree with you there, that when he puts it out as a self-conscious lie, I think that is inaccurate, and it's going to be repulsive to some people, because some of us know that it's false. I remember when I was a believer how I believed and how I felt, and I wasn't trying to deceive myself or anybody else. There did come a point on the way out of my belief that happened, but it wasn't always that way.
Now, gentlemen, what I would like to, I'd like to move forward a little bit. Bob has been very patient, and before I throw it to Bob one more time, I would like to just interject one little thing. I'm going to get to the viewer comments as soon as we're done talking to Bob, and so that this doesn't turn into like the normal like hours, plural, long hangout. After we talk to Bob, or after we address what Bob has to say, and after we address a couple of the statements that have been made in the thread and that exist in our comment section on the broadcast that's happening right now, I'd like to wrap it up because I wouldn't have a problem with leaving the people wanting more. That being said, Bob, I'd like you to address some of the things that you already said, some of the things that you haven't already said. I'd like you to address this once again, tabula rasa, as if this is the first time you've addressed it.
Well, thank you. You know, and I heard a lot of things here that I know I can totally agree with, both from David Silverman and also from Ozzy and from Matthew. And I thought that some of your questions also were very good and addressed some very, very intuitive points that are relevant to struggle with. One of the things, though, that I think is important to recognize is we talk about a standard of evidence. And, of course, you work in a lab. And in a lab, as you're working there, for example, if we were going to say that if we mix these two chemicals together, that somehow mixing them together will cause them to raise in temperature by 5 degrees Celsius. So they may be at a particular temperature prior to mixing them together. You mix them together. Instead of them being at their average temperature, some sort of a chemical reaction is going on and it releases heat. The standard of evidence that we want for that is a thermometer. We can't hold it in our hand and say, oh, you know, I think it's warmer. It feels to me like 5 degrees Celsius. You know, that's not the standard of evidence. I want to argue that the standard of evidence is unique to every discipline and to every question within that discipline as to whether or not that evidence is in fact a measure of anything from which we can draw our conclusions. And I totally agree with Ozzy that rationality has to do with the process by which we arrive at a particular claim. And not necessarily just the claim in and of itself. Now, when it comes to, for example, the evidence that I need to determine what color something is something where I might need a spectrometer or, you know, whatever they do, however they measure the wavelengths of light. It requires that kind of instrumentation to determine it. But one thing that you can never do in any manner is you can't determine what color something is by putting your ear to it. Your ear cannot hear the color. The problem that I have with this one statement, and I agree with it, by the way, the amount of evidence to establish the existence of a supernatural being is 0. I totally agree with that. However, we're talking about a supernatural being. But we're talking about us being, you know, limited to this world and to our sensory perception by which most of the stuff that we experience comes through. And we're talking about evidence that we're looking for. Well, I'm sorry. If you're talking about a supernatural being, you can't possibly be talking about evidence. What is the standard of evidence that we're going to use to measure the validity of any supernatural claim? Now, I do think that Ozzy is totally correct also in saying, well, you know, if we're going to just endorse anything that possesses possibility, we're going to be embracing a wide variety of inconsistent concepts, all of them perhaps by their own, you know, plausible in some manner. And I also think that it's interesting that he points out that that all of these people who have these experiences nonetheless point them to different gods. As a theist myself, I believe that all the gods that we point our experience to are a fabrication of our imagination in many real ways. But that the experience that there is this presence may be inarticulate, may be something that we can't describe. It may be something we can never nail down with anything that we can relate to, that we articulate. But that still doesn't mean that we aren't necessarily having an experience that we all explain in terms that make sense to us.
Bob, I call you on something.
Sure.
You haven't been honest with us. You have a golden idol on the wall behind you, and I think it's time you finally admitted who you
really?
were.
Okay, where's the gold? Oh, the SpongeBob? Yeah, you know, I have a whole collection of various different plush toys, and my wife
Well
wanted to
played,
decorate
Matthew. Well
them in here.
played.
Yes, it's my golden idol. Yeah, yeah. You know, so I do think though that that the justification for articulating specifics about the supernatural is very loosey goosey and subject to a great deal of great suspicion. In fact, I would even say that that some of the theology that I have, weak as it is, for example, it strikes me as absurd and ridiculous that it could ever be true that people are obligated to believe in something for which there's no evidence to compel it. I use that rationality as part of my theology in believing that the God that I am in belief of is not a God who could in any manner require that, or we're all screwed because he's just a bad dude who hasn't grown up yet. But you know, so there's a sense in which my theology can be shaped by some of these natural conclusions, but at the same time, you know, this doesn't prove anything. And it in some sense it helps me to eliminate perhaps certain possibilities as being just totally incongruent. You know, some of the things that I do think that we do need to think in terms about here is that the standard of evidence does perhaps actually exist. It's just not available to us. For example, if there really is a God who created, even through the Big Bang, all that is, it's possible that his presence is manifested in everything. It's just that we can't see it. And maybe it's not until sometime after death that we'll then have the sort of eyes that we see it. Oh, there it is. Well, you know, until that day happens, nobody's really compelled to believe it. And you know, if that day comes along and in fact, if we wake up and we're all dead, you know,
What a great sentence.
yeah,
We wake up and we're all dead.
yeah, then I suppose it doesn't really matter. So there is a sense in that, although I am a theist, I just can't conceive of a theism that has to be somehow so central in our lives, or so compelling, or anything we need to be arguing about in any sense. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I would say that if we want to talk about irrationality, we have to demonstrate that there is a appreciable, indismissible requirement that we can establish first before we can say that something lacks the rationale that is needed by it. You know, because irrationality is we assess that on based on the way that an opinion is arrived at. If it uses an inadequate amount of reason in order to arrive there, and if there's a failure in that process to appreciate certain requirements that we can determine are indismissible, and if we find that that emotional distress is disturbing our clarity, and some sort of cognitive deficiency is demonstrated to be at work, you know, we can then, you know, we can make irrational claims. But I do think that theism is irrational.
Explain that.
It is a pardon me?
Explain that.
Well, it's the kind of thing where the most theists, and by the way, I totally disagreed with this other statement, which is going to lead into an answer to that. One of the things David Silverman said is that, you know, Dr. Jones and other theists are just avoiding death. They're afraid of death. I became a theist at the age of 6, 7. You know, I had no concept of death. You know, I was a child. I was going to live forever. I didn't even realize that the older people in my life were one day going to be gone. You know, I mean, the truth is, the first family member in my life that ever died, I was 30. You know, by the time they died. So, you know, death wasn't a central part of it, and trying to avoid anything about death was certainly not on my mind as I became a person. What I had was, for me, through what seemed to me to be my sensory perception, this experience of a presence. And that presence was something that seemed to be not just there, but with me. Now, that's entirely a perception. Could I have been crazy? Oh, absolutely. May I have been hallucinating? Is there perhaps a biochemical explanation for this? Very possibly. you know. But for me, this was a very real experience, and it is the basis of why I leaned in that direction of, you know, this presence being God. What do I know about that presence? Not a damn thing, really. You know, nothing. Now I've thought about it. I've come up with ideas, and eventually I actually became a fundamentalist because, well, I didn't know better. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and I left it because it stopped
Famous
seeming
last
like a,
words. It was a good idea at the time.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I left it for that same reason. It just stopped being a good idea, you know. And now I certainly have come to a point where I wasn't at as a young man, where I've completely realized that, and I've said this before, I am completely naked. I come as a theist. I have nothing other than myself with which to make that assertion.
And that's why we
And
love you, Bob. And that is exactly the reason why we love you. That's why you are so popular on the NCG network. That is why your message resonates with so many people. That's why you get so many messages, and so do I, and so does Dr. Jones, saying, oh, this Bob Graves, I don't know what's going on with him, but if more theists were like him, I might be able to resonate with a theist coming from the atheist camp. So I don't mean to interrupt, but like I said, I kind of want to keep the show a little concise. Now, I'm going to do something that that normally doesn't happen on NCG shows, and I'm going to address some of the comments after I throw it to Dr. Jones. I'm going to address some of the comments, and I want rapid-fire answers. Now, I know that all of us think and speak in paragraphs, so that might be a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to do my best to redirect everybody towards maybe wrapping this up in about 20 minutes. That being said, I would like to throw it to Dr. Jones.
You know, I've really enjoyed the comments tonight. I've really enjoyed, you know, for instance, the comments of David Silverman. And this is doing me a lot of good, to be honest with you.
You and me both.
But I have a frog in my throat or something like that. But one of the things that I'd like Matthew Steele to do, and this won't take but maybe 2 minutes, can you go to my wall, Kaine Diatheke, and actually read the first 2 comments that Bob Graves made in that particular thread, Matthew?
Sure. Just give me a second and I'll pull that up.
And for those of you that are watching that aren't members of the Cult of Honesty Facebook page, or Kaine Diatheke's Facebook page, or the New Covenant Group's Facebook page, I think now is a great segue into saying, why not? You know, Kaine Diatheke is Dr. Jones' Facebook page. The New Covenant Groups is obviously the umbrella Facebook page for us, but the Cult of Honesty is really where we start getting into the nitty-gritty about these kinds of topics. So I hope I filled enough time maybe for Matthew to find what Dr. Jones is looking for.
Yes. The original comment, which was posted 11 hours ago, was, I believe in God. So am I crazy, irrational, and avoiding what's true? Phrased as a question. The first message, if this is what you meant, Dr. Jones, Bob Graves made the following comment about this OP on my wall. I can see how knowledge claims without logic can be labeled as irrational, but beliefs operate on a different axis than knowledge claims and are adjusted by a different standard. Requiring the exact same empirical standards on coherent possibilities as one does for knowledge claims is too passive-aggressive. Belief claims and knowledge claims depend upon very different cognitive operations. Commingling the two is a false apples and oranges comparison. And then the next one.
Okay, go ahead and read the second one.
Okay, if you'd like to comment, I'll wait.
Bob, would you like to explain this a little bit deeper for us?
Yeah, sure. Many times, even in the philosophy of mind, they will describe knowledge as justified true belief. I find that a lacking definition. As an example, if I'm driving home from work and I come home and I get home at 4:30, and I know that my daughter leaves for work at 4:15, and I come home and I find that the door is unlocked, I might be able to conclude and believe that my daughter left the door unlocked. But I don't know that. And I would say it's a justified belief. If it turns out that she actually did leave the door unlocked, and I discover later that it's true, then my belief may be a justified true belief, but I would argue that it is still not knowledge. Now, if I'd seen her walk out the door, and then I came to the door and found it continued to be unlocked, that might be knowledge. Later, after when I speak with her and she goes, "Oh, oops, yeah, I forgot to lock the door," then I know it's no longer a belief. And so when we have a belief, it is because we don't have all of the information, and yet a conclusion seems to be required in order for us to move on with life or do whatever it is we need to do, or even make decisions. And so it is a reasonable thing to conclude that maybe she's the. But it's possible that I didn't know it, that my wife came home from work and then had to run an errand, and she ran out. She came home just after Leah left, and then I come home after she's gone, and she's the one who left the door unlocked. So this is the difference, I think, between belief. Belief can never become knowledge, and knowledge can never be belief. Now, that's not to say that what we believe can't become knowledge. It can. But the cognitive, psychological process by which we form beliefs is one dynamic, and the way in which we believe that, the way we come to something that is verified, validated, and known to us to be so, is something else. Now, they certainly commingle and they get together, and very few of us stop to think about what's going on inside of our mind and how these dynamics work, and no doubt they're even commingling and working together. But belief and knowledge really are two different things, and they operate on different axes within the brain.
Okay. I appreciate you going into detail about that first response. Now, as I mentioned, I did want to make this a little bit more concise. So, in lieu of...
Sorry, I'll try.
Oh, no. In lieu of addressing the second comment that Dr. Jones asked Matthew to read, I'd like to jump right into the people that are watching, what they have to say. Some of the things that they have to say, unfortunately, had to do with when Dave was here, and so I can't really address those. So for those of you that had specific questions for Dave, his limitation on time really prevents me from getting your questions to him, obviously because he's not here right now, and because we kind of had a really nice exchange and dialogue while he was here. So that being said, some of these questions are directed to Matthew, some of them are directed to me. So I'm going to be totally selfish and start with the one that has to do with me. So crucifixion, which is spelled cruci-fiction, as in fiction, as compared to nonfiction, says, this NCG atheist has one foot in the woo-woo door. Crucifixion, give me a break. Just give me a break. I'd like to explain just one thing to you. The questions that I ask and bring up for the sake of discussion don't necessarily reflect exactly what I believe. I am into really awesome dialogue. And for anybody else who happens to be watching that thinks that I might have a foot in the woo-woo door, I would like to remind you that Dr. John Shook, who is also here in Florida, hosted me at a think tank called the Center for Inquiry, where for 3 weeks I was a part of an education program, a teacher, if you will, and my role was to address woo. My goal was to be the skeptic dealing with naturopathy, homeopathy, complementary and alternative medicines. So please, please do not misunderstand my ability to engage and stir the soups for awesome dialogue as some kind of belief in woo. So that being said, please give me a break. That being said, there's a question for Matthew here from Greg Bray. Our friend Greg Bray. We love Greg Bray. Greg Bray says, Matthew is saying that the word God is very plastic, but that is really not addressing the issue at hand. Charitable argumentation implies he should interpret, hold on a second, something just changed. He should interpret the atheist assertion as it is intended. Want me to read that one more time?
No, I just saw it when Greg wrote it, but it was too much to unpack in just a short response, or really to. That's what I'm asking you to do. Address.
This is kind of like a lightning round. I need you to be as pithy as possible, please.
I'll try to put it in the context of the discussion we were having with Dave, because I think that's a very important discussion to have. Most of the time, when someone does say God, in the U.S. at least, they are talking about Jesus / Yahweh, however they choose to define the Trinity of Abrahamic religions. So it's not necessarily inaccurate to say that God means something more than that when the person you're talking to may believe that's exactly what it does mean. So it just seems to me like when Dave talks about God, he is only talking about the Abrahamic God. But what about deists? What about pantheists? What about someone who has a very nuanced understanding of the Bible, where they don't agree with any religious understanding of it? They have their own understanding. There's too much to the word to simply say it only means Yahweh. However, as Greg rightly points out, most of the time you're going to be talking to someone who does mean that. So it's not necessarily inaccurate to say it doesn't mean that. It's only inaccurate when you try to say it only means that. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay. I appreciate your response and the fact that you kept it really nice and quick. Yours was quicker than mine. Vlad Tepes, which is, that's the original name of Dracula, isn't it? Vlad. Anyway, Vlad Tepes says, I don't think that it's rational to assert anything as a fact that can't be objectively demonstrated. However, it's perfectly rational to admit that there is plenty of things that we don't know. I'm going to throw this to Ozzy.
I'm sorry, I had just cut my audio off a little. Could you repeat the question? I knew it was Vlad, but I didn't hear it all.
Okay, very good. Vlad Tepes says, I don't think that it's rational to assert anything as a fact that can't be objectively demonstrated. However, it's perfectly rational to admit that there is plenty of things that we don't know.
I can't answer that with concision.
I can just say I agree.
Okay.
I agree with part of it. Vlad, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be evasive. It's going to take me 15 minutes to address that properly.
I know, like I said, all of us, for those of you that are watching, we all up here think in paragraphs and have a habit of talking such. So the challenge that I'm proposing might be a little bit more hardcore than the question that you asked, right? There is such a thing as really simple questions with not simple answers.
No, most people could do it. I'm not that person.
I love Ozzy's paragraphs. I got to tell you.
Without a doubt.
When he speaks, I do lean forward, and so does my wife. He says things very well.
Well, I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna switch over to some of the comments that have been made on the actual threads, in the hopes that the people that responded to Dr. Jones's original thread, which is the purpose of this episode, in the hopes that they're watching. And maybe some of the questions or comments that they have can be addressed. So the first thing that I have here is, C.B. Warren, and I'm going to address this to you, Bob, because I believe it was in response to you. C.B. Warren says, so when you believe something, you don't necessarily take that article of belief to be true? That's news to me. That was in response to something that you said. Now, is that an accurate assessment of what you said?
I don't see, the belief that something is true is not the same thing as the claim that it is true. It is, and I think I'd even argue that it's closer to the concept of suspicion. That it may be true, it may not be true. I think that all faith has to be held, at an arm's distance from being, just pulled entirely inside as if it's reliable. It is not. However, you might be in a situation where you have to make a decision and you're going to have to act on it. But I don't see belief as being as having any of the qualities of truth that, say, knowledge has. And in fact, I don't think that faith or belief ever has the right to trump that which we can empirically demonstrate.
I'm going to bust your chops. Here's another comment from the same thread based on the same comment that you made from Steve March that says, Bob Graves, belief has nothing to do with truth?
Well, I don't know that it has nothing to do with truth. It is an attempt to grasp for it. It certainly, belief doesn't have anything to do with verifiable truth. That's knowledge, you know. But belief is an attempt to make a really good guess at what may very likely be true, and it may in fact be true. So it has a relationship with truth only in that it just might be, you know, but it doesn't have a relationship with truth in that it somehow is. Well, I suppose anything that's true would perhaps have some sort of dynamic to it or manifestation that leans in that direction, but that isn't the same thing as knowing it to be true.
I want to read another comment that I'm just going to put it out there as something I totally agree with, and I like the way that John Chaky, I can only imagine that that's how it's pronounced, Chaky, has to say on later down in that same thread, and this is just a statement, and I love it. So here it is. Well, I've yet to meet a human who isn't at least partially crazy, irrational, and avoiding what's true. If believing in God gets you through that fairly unavoidable circumstance, ain't none of my business. Thank you, John Chaky, for that comment, because it rocks my fat ass. That being said, Philip Cooper also has a comment, and I'm going to start wrapping it up soon. I'm going to get two more in here. So the second to last will be Philip Cooper. He says, the issue I have with belief in a God isn't the multitude of ways any one of the claims could be true, only the lack of any verifiable reason to believe that any one claim is actually true. I'm going to say that one more time. The issue I have with belief in a God isn't the multitude of ways any one of the claims could be true, only the lack of any verifiable reason to believe that any one claim is actually true. I'm going to throw that to Matthew.
I need you to read it again for me, because sure. There was too much to it.
I know, it's a nuanced point. So I think that what he's saying is the issue I have with belief in God isn't the multitude of ways in which any one of the claims could be true, so in other words, talking about the whole. I think that his point is only the lack of verifiable reason to believe that any one claim is true, right? So if there is a body of beliefs, it's not really a matter of saying that anyone is true, any being the main term for the whole. It's more of an issue of if you took one of those claims within that body, there's no verifiable reason to believe that that individual claim is true. That's what he's talking. It seems like he's talking about the difference between a belief that exists in the ethers outside of us versus an individual specific belief that cannot be verified.
All right.
I didn't understand it that way.
No, okay, well, please, that's how I understand it. Ozzy, I would love for your input.
Yeah, unpack it, Ozzy.
Okay, my sense was that it was going to Matthew's earlier point about how mere logical possibility of all the kinds of gods that there are, for instance. There are many, many kinds of gods, many kinds of theism. And, yeah, sure, there's no way to sort of rule them all out a priori. There's no one argument that's a defeater of all of these claims all at once. But it's sufficient to say, well, look, at any particular case that we have looked at, there's not enough good reason to think that it's true. What the heck more do you want from me? Do I have to have do I have to be able to demolish them all at once a priori?
No.
And so I think that's what the questioner was okay. asking.
Yeah, right, and I have the same problem. I think it's a very real.
Let's let Matthew address that real quick.
I could definitely speak to that. I would just point out again that I am with regards to the beliefs that most people have about God in the U.S. and Western countries at least, and the Middle East and wherever else that the Abrahamic God is worshipped. I believe that God does not exist based on my own understanding of what he is supposed to be. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that I believe that it does not. But that being said, to speak to the point that he's making, and this comes back again, Ozzy, to the discussion you and I had on my first Elephant in the Room show, whether or not it's justified to say that something like God does not exist, whether or not you have an understanding of every possible meaning of the word. Whether or not you can say God doesn't exist because you've heard 947,000 explanations, but there are actually 948,000, and there are 1,000 that you just haven't heard yet. So you can't necessarily say no, God doesn't exist unless you've heard all 948,000. But that is the kind of the point that I'm making, and it's kind of not too, because I think I'm coming at this in a different direction than he interpreted. I don't think that it's justified rationally to say that something is the case simply because you haven't heard an argument for why it's not. And that seems to be what Dave was saying. Like, just because someone hasn't presented you with an argument why something is true doesn't mean that it's automatically false. Just because you haven't heard from someone a good reason to believe something is true doesn't mean that in fact it's untrue. It just means so far you haven't heard a good reason, that's all. No one has given you a good reason, you haven't thought of one, so you're justified in not accepting that it's true. You're not, in my opinion, justified in saying it's false.
Right. I agree with you, and I would say that even if you hear 900,000 assertions that just lack anything compelling, the fact that you could actually go through that would mean that, well, even if it is true, it can't possibly be important.
Now, I'd like to move on a little bit. We only have a couple minutes left. Some people made some really awesome statements that I'm just going to read out loud to close the show, and also to tip the hat of NCG towards the idea that we love when you join into the conversation. In fact, if you're watching this show right now and you have yet to subscribe to the YouTube channel on which this is being broadcast, please do so. Because if you like this kind of conversation, and apparently we've had most, on average, about 35 to 40 viewers throughout this broadcast. If all 40 of you are have subscribed to us, rock on. But let's face it, the reason that you guys came to this and stayed is because there's something about what we're saying that you like. You're picking up what we're throwing down. If you like this exact kind of conversation, it is your responsibility to opt in to the discussion. Join it. Subscribe to us. If you subscribe to us, you will be hip to everything that we're doing, and we can fold you into the mix. That being said, here's a couple of statements. Dennis Finley. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. No, I'm sorry. David Ariel Hickman says, my view is that belief in God is a misattribution of the imagination. I'm just going to let that hang out there while I say a couple more things. Debbie Ann Ward says, my motto is, I don't believe everything I think. That is awesome. Another awesome statement comes from Jeremy Lane Hale, who says, I don't think it's crazy to believe in a God, but to believe in the biblical God is pretty ridiculous in my opinion, which addresses the complete point of what God are we talking about. And I'm just going to read one more that really resonates with me at least, and this comes from Michael Camp. We live in a world where empirical observation, for example science, is only one way of determining reliable knowledge. Michael, I would love to have a conversation with you because that was one of the points that I attempted to make to Dave Silverman tonight. And it was the qualitative-quantitative distinction that I made. And he kind of took it in this direction that that dismissed qualitative evidence, in my opinion. So that being said, I would like to thank all of our panelists for showing up. In case you missed it, we had Matthew Steele on tonight, Bob Graves, the unconventional pastor. And by the way, Matthew Steele is also a host here at the New Covenant Group. He has a show called Elephant in the Room. Once again, Bob Graves, the unconventional pastor. And then there's Ozzy. Well, what can I say about Ozzy other than his contributions are immeasurably invaluable. He's able to pick apart a nuanced topic in such a way that when he gets done unpacking it, you may very well change your mind about what it is that he's talking about. And lastly, and not leastly, I want to thank Dr. Jones for giving me this opportunity to even have this rogue hangout and be in this awesome studio and have all these crazy cameras pointing at me.
You're more than welcome. You've done an excellent job tonight. One of the points that I wanted to make is, behind the scenes, we have a crew that does an awesome job. And not only that, we have Dr. Shook in the back. He's in the control room trying to just, make comments to everyone else who's making comments. And this is what NCG is about. We have philosophers, we have people from almost every different category attempting to come together and have meaningful dialogue. And this is awesome. So why don't you close us out?
All right. Everyone who's watching, I want you to know, my name is Christopher Mowdy, and I'm part of the New Covenant Group, and I'm proud of it. I would love for you to join the conversation because without you, we aren't anything. Good night.